So hello everyone. It's a great joy after intensive week of work, of writing emails and being in touch with the with different poetic circles around the world to uh, welcome everyone to the opening event of our Festival of Hope. This is Versopolis. It's a platform of international poetry festivals from all around Europe, supported by the European Union. We are close to be 30 festivals who collaborate at Versopolis. What happened to us happened to many more poetry festivals and other culture organizers around the world, namely that events got cancelled or postponed, that organizers are facing big trouble and big uncertainty whether their programs will go on next year or they will have to shut down. Of course, facing the pandemic, the global pandemic, these are perhaps right at this moment less important questions. On the other hand, we believe that through culture, through the power of the spoken and the written word, through poetry, we can steer hope, and there is nothing more needed than hope, I think, in this moment. I am very glad that three distinguished poets and writers, essayists from around the world join me for this opening conversation. I'd like to welcome Sharmistha Mohanty from Mumbai, Carolyn Forché from Washington, D.C., and young Lian from Berlin/Beijing. You're based now in Berlin, but I know you're commuting a lot between China and Berlin. We hope we are starting our emails lately, perhaps even more intensified with this phrase which is becoming a vital one. I don't want to ground this conversation only in what is going on around us in the last couple of weeks, but also opening it up to our future. And I would like to start basically with a very basic question to all of you. In times like this, in times of severe crisis, how do you as writers, as poets react? I mean, physically, is it something that creates you work, or is it something rather that makes you stop working, getting into a position of inability, let's say, to find words for what is surrounding us, and let's say just absorbing and taking in the very unusual circumstances we live in? Sharmistha, perhaps you would like to start.
You know, I would say, Aleš, that it's a bit of both, maybe. It's, I have been writing and working, and for me, I think that really keeps me and maybe many of us very sane throughout this time, that we can be in a world which is different than the physical reality that we're going through. But at the same time, there are days when, you know, you read the reports and you can't work because things are just so terrible. And here in India, we've had a lot of additional problems, as you may have read in the papers, that we have a very sizable population of migrant laborers who no longer have jobs or shelters and have been wanting to actually walk home hundreds of miles to the villages that they come from. So it's it's complete catastrophe in terms of a lot of people actually not even getting food or shelter. So I think it's been harder for us here on that front, although the virus doesn't seem to be so virulent yet here. We don't know what's going to happen in the future. But yeah, to answer your question, I think it's a bit of both. That's what I would say.
Carolyn, you shaped or you coined the phrase poetry of witness. Do you feel yourself in a position of being a witness of something now, or is it something basically that makes you just stay without words?
About me?
No, Carolyn.
Carolyn, please.
I would say that the poetry of witness was a way of reading poems written in the aftermath of extremity. And that extremity was collectively born or inflicted by the state. So I collected the works of poets who had endured warfare, house arrest, imprisonment, exile. And what interested me about it was that the work and the language itself was marked by these experiences. What occurs to me now is that all of humanity is being transformed in consciousness by an experience we are collectively having for the first time, in the sense that we are all able to communicate with each other. This is happening to us not as members of particular nation states or nationalities, but as a species. And I think we're all being marked right now by this experience, and our language will bear that mark in the future. In answer to your other question, I think in the beginning there was shock, a kind of numbness, wondering what we should do. And then there was a strange, I experienced a kind of distraction, a kind of, sometimes I would sleep at odd hours, have strange dreams. I found out other people were doing the same thing. Other people were having these dreams, other people's sleep had been disrupted. And we were, for the first time, even though we were all collectively experiencing the same thing, we are all isolated, away from each other. We're deprived of presence. And so I think we have a measure of solitude we didn't have before, and perhaps that can bring with it a certain kind of peace and awareness and access to our inner being so that we can write. But at the same time, we're suppressed by a worry, concern for others, fear, wondering when we'll be able to emerge again. And I also think it's given us a real appreciation for what it really meant to be together, to be able to be together.
I see, just to reply a bit, I see it also from the organizers' point of view, of the many organizers of literary events, how much they truly miss what they've been doing for a number of years, and how much hope they put basically in now new forms that develop all over the world, basically in the net, although we all know this cannot be a true substitute, not on the long run, for what we shared before. Lian, you've been of course in touch with the Chinese reality, and probably much better informed than all of us already when the virus broke out in Wuhan, and probably now you also see how already the aftermath of the times of the virus, which is being quite controlled in China. Did this make you write or react in any way?
Well, I must say, firstly, hope or hopeless is a very traditional Chinese topic, which is we have been experienced that almost since, let's say, ancient time, 1,000 years ago, and especially the recent history. And it's always fighting inside of this crazy storm. But number two is this special situation today, like linked with virus, but far more than only the virus, politically, culturally, socially, and starting from Wuhan, and the first place in the world, isolated the whole city, and then the people experience, let's say, directly what's the mean of jail, you know, and it's not only the prisoners in jail, but everyone is in the jail, and that was the terrible experience. And then, of course, it's a beginning from Wuhan and China, but soon now becoming a global situation, and everyone directly experience the reality which Chinese people experience for so long. And at this time, one very, very interesting things happened, because all people in Wuhan and in China has to stay in home and not allowed to go out of the door. And suddenly the language, the writing becoming extremely important. Is millions and billions of people have been waiting until the midnight, and for the two writers who live in Wuhan and wrote their diaries and directly talk about their first-hand of experience of the life, and they, because they talk differently from any kind of official media, and therefore the people share and exchange their feelings with them so let's say deeply, and this passion about their writings was unbelievable. And one of the writers called Xiao, and he is a poet, and therefore because he writes poetry, so his feeling was very much down to earth, very sincerely, and the way of writing was a very settled, no propaganda feeling, no such thing, but very detailed into the life. And that's, I have to say, it's almost like a poetry, but in the prose form. After sometimes it starts from the February, our magazine, Survivors Poetry magazine, published the last issue, especially focused at the virus. And I, as the chief editor, I especially recommended Xiaoyin's poems as a poet, and therefore to show how the poetry actually leads his prose writing. And now huge number of the poetry and the prose and essays been created based on the trouble. And also we see how this trouble now becoming a global situation, and how the world in a very dark way, but united together directly with this situation. So I'm sure the hope is actually came out from this hopeless situation.
That's a very good point that you're making. We called our festival of Hope just because of that reason, since we truly believe that poetry and artistic expression does matter even more in times of severe crisis. We are in, I think, probably globally in a very strange situation due to the pandemic. Much less books are being produced as normally. On the other hand, much more books are being read, not just because people are locked in their homes, but also because there is a deep search, I think, a communal search among most of us for specific answers, or at least some firm ground beneath our feet that seem to be missing quite many times in the last decades. So if we write, if we react, is in times like this, is it connected, at least for you, in your own, let's say, philosophy of writing? Is it connected with a gesture of hope? I mean, when we speak about hope, we usually, at least in Europe, we connect it to the Greek myths, to Pandora, to the jar out of which all the bad stuff was released among humans, also illnesses. But then the jar was closed, sealed again, and hope stayed at the bottom. Is it basically what you personally feel as something you would like to reach out in this moment, or you would say perhaps that it's rather our act of resistance if you find yourself in the position to be creative these days?
Well, I myself just wrote one poem linked with this very situation, and within the poem there is one question, a little bit philosophically. What is death? Is death cut us off or linked us together? And that is a very, let's say, extreme question about our situation now. And I think that's really the point of this situation today, because well, we talked about the poetry festival as well, because we all have been so many festivals. But let's say for all those poetry festivals, they have one darker side, which is normally our so-called professional poets are there, and some audience who love poetry are there, but nothing to do with most of other people. But what's the poetry today to me is the poetry is happening in everyone's life and mind. And this life and death, which is normally the theme of poetry to deal with, but now it's been pushed and pushed at so directly in front of everybody's eyes and everybody's heart. And what do you feel and think about that? I think when the human being, everybody has to thinking her or his situation like this, and they give a great ground of poetry to grow. And I think that's what the important thing, maybe we could call hope.
Carolyn, what would you say? Is it an act of hope, poetry these days?
We can't hear you. We can't
hear you.
Manlio Argueta, the Salvadoran novelist, wrote, "Hope also nourishes us, not the hope of fools, the other kind. Hope when everything is clear, awareness." So for him, hope is awareness, hope is clarity, hope is finally coming to a measure of understanding about what life really means and what is at stake and who we are as human beings. As Lian was saying, it is a life and death issue now. So we're coming awake, I think. And that's a hopeful thing. As for poetry, Bertolt Brecht was asked about that, about whether poetry would survive dark times. And of course, he said, they said, in the dark times, will there also be singing? Yes, there will be singing about the dark times. So I think people turn to poetry in times like this, not only to read it, to write it, to listen to it, to think about it more than in other times. And it might be because it's probably our oldest art form. And it's the only one made out of nothing but our own language, our own creation. And so people are returning to that deeply inside themselves, I think now.
I was facing this phenomenon twice. in the Yugoslav wars and in times of severe economic crisis, 2007-8, when the book sales fell dramatically, at least in Slovenia, of all books, apart of poetry books. So, so you could really see that people were turning to the poets to listen to them. At least part of the people turned to the poets in times of severe crisis. I think perhaps it's also a question of belief. Whom do I believe in dark times? Sharmistha, what do you think?
I don't know. I would first like to say that that's, you know, it's very beautiful what Lian said, because I hadn't thought of it like that, that actually humanity seems to have come together because of a force of darkness rather than a force of light. I mean, force of light hasn't seemed to be able to have brought us together, but this has. And that is quite an amazing thing to me. As far as the role of poetry, Aleš, and hope, I think, you know, what Carolyn is saying, I agree with it. I think that I would add something a little more to it, which is that we, as poets, as, you know, human beings, must also think about how we've treated the world. And we must also think about other ways of approaching life. You know, not just, you know, to me, hope is in a way to become more lean, you know, less kind of a centripetal force, so to speak, rather than a centrifugal force that we seem to be living by, to do less, not more, and to step back and maybe make a less homogenized world, which, you know, in a way, poetry is directly related to. Right now, we have a world which is, you know, even the most traditional, older, past-driven places, you know, kind of define themselves in relation to the centers of the world and to centers of power, to globalization, you know. And I think that people need to step back from that, to look at the fact that each culture has its own understanding of what knowledge is. Knowledge is not just science, it's not just textual. I mean, as you know, in India, we have a vast array of other knowledge systems which somehow are still alive. So in each culture, at least, I suppose in non-Western cultures, those things are alive. And I think that poetry, in those cultures at least, needs to draw from that, is drawing from that. And the world does need to look at reaching out to things which are not supposedly also universal.
I think there is a great ambivalence in our feelings right now. On one hand, we see this unifying force that, as Carolyn put it so beautifully, really connects us, creates a community, a global community in a way that nothing did before, ever before in human history. On the other hand, there is great fear of the future. And there are so many personal and other theories what will happen tomorrow with this communal experience, how we're going to treat it. And what we try to do also with the festival that will start basically tomorrow is to make a small gesture to say, look how much beauty, how much creativity, and how much seeking for truth and for the right thing there is out there. You have just to have a glimpse into this vast universe, whether be it through the net or in any other way. Before we started this conversation, I was asking you if you could prepare each of you a text, a poem of yours to be read, because I think that's also what a big majority of our viewers and listeners is here for, to hear your work, to be read in presence. Please, who would like to start? Sharmistha, would you like to start, please?
Sure. Bring us near, nearer, not further far. Take us close, closer. Unbuild us to soil, gravel, mud. Fold back the excess of cloth so we may weave again. Unmake us. A nocturnal sorrow opens over the great river plains. The falcon with a single wing flies alongside. Move us from unfire to fire. Return stone to the mountains. Unfirm us. The alcoholic stoops low on his plastic stool in the middle of precarious alleyway. Unsure our voices so we can listen sometimes. Make us many, the not one, and only then make us one, the not two. Take us away from calculations so there remains only near and distant, high and low, early and late, the front and the back, and the four directions.
Thank you very much, Sharmistha. Perhaps you can tell just 2-3 words connected to the poem. Where did it appear, and if there is a story attached to it?
You know, Aleš, these poems were I began writing them about 3 years ago in this new book, and they're very hard to put it into words, you know. It's there in the poem. I think there's a need in me, as I said earlier, to kind of become leaner, to get to the most fundamental things. I was also partly influenced in writing these poems by some very old texts in the Indian tradition, namely the Rig Veda, which is the very, very first text that we have in our civilization, and it's from about 1500 BC. And I felt the need to go back to very elemental things and look at life from there.
Mm-hmm. This connects very much also to the present. I've asked everyone to share something that has at least some notion of hope in it. Not to illustrate hope, of course, that would be inappropriate, but to have a sensation, and we could feel it very much there. Thank you very much for your reading, Sharmistha.
Thank you.
Carolyn, can I ask you to share with us one of your poems?
Yes, this poem, I'll tell you the history of it after I read it, but it's called What Comes, and it begins with an epigraph by the French resistance poet René Char. What comes? I brought from despair a basket so small, my love, that it might have been woven of willow. René Char. To speak is not yet to have spoken, the not yet of a white realm of nothing left, neither for itself nor another, a no longer already there, along with the arrival of what has been, light and the reverse of light, terror as walking blind along the breaking sea, body in whom I lived, the not yet of death, darkening what it briefly illuminates, an unknown place as between languages, back and forth, breath to breath. As a calm in the surround rises, fireflies in lindens, an ache of pine, you have yourself within you. yourself, you have her, and there is nothing that cannot be seen. Open then to the coming of what comes.
Beautiful. Thank you.
The poem was written at a time when I was having chemotherapy, and at a time when I didn't know whether I would live or not. And it was, in a sense, a poem to reassure myself. And so I chose it to read today because in some ways, I think we're all experiencing a glimmer of that feeling. So I wanted to reassure us.
Beautiful.
It's very beautiful. Listening to it, I had to think about the melting cynicism that's in the world, especially in the arts world. We are surrounded usually by cynicism, by very sharp irony that has very often a main goal not to disclose but to destroy. And of course now, since everyone is in one's jail, one's isolation, one's solitude, there is much less reason to be cynical, but to be very much open to very basic questions. And this gives back power to poetry very often. I know of people who haven't read poetry for decades probably. They are reading poetry and listening to poets now, and I hope they will keep on doing. Lian, could we have your poem, please?
But my case is a bit more difficult because I never read my poems in my Younglish. I mean, because it's so difficult to read the musically out of the same poems different from my own tongue. So I will read this poem in my Chinese, but may I just introduce a little bit. This poem is titled Sunflower Seeds, Lines of Negation, and dedicated to the Chinese artist Ai Weiwei. And because he is a Chinese artist, but he's also doing something socially and politically. And once he had been put into jail because he went to checking why so many school buildings was clogged in Sichuan, and more than 5,000 kids was killed. And but he got the trouble with the local authorities, and then he was being put in the jail. And then the poem was written when he was in jail, because the title was based on an installation that he made. It's called Sunflower Seeds. There were 150 tons of sunflower seeds, but all made by the porcelain and hand painted. And that's like a huge installation. And this poem actually is turned himself as one of the sunflower seeds and speak out. And all poems, every sentence in the form of negation until the very last line, refusing to let the poem sink into that indifferent beauty. That means I hope poetry keeping the soul and warm blood within the self. And I learned from all the poets, which is the life experience. Everything we experience actually lead us to understand of the writing, and whatever big or small things. So in that case, I think we are in the way of thinking of poetry, we are so close and exactly the same, almost. So I'll read a poem. I hope you will get the translation later from our program. Yeah. 一粒葵花籽的否定句，致艾未未。不能想象，这瓷质的江水中，曾泊着杜甫的扁舟。我不认识月光，只看见诗句的皎洁在一行行衰减，致无人，致象征。谈论一切，又回避一切。我不是象征，死在一粒葵花籽硬壳下的太阳，也不是孩子们雪白坍塌的肉，并没有消失。一条破晓的地平线，不可能忘了那阵疼。骨头被玻璃切开时，像玻璃，来不及叫喊，才不得不在每天的曙光中叫喊。一场地震不会停止，一种窒息不在死后，种植到天边的栅栏靠着更难堪的沉默。因此，我不怕年轻女警察审视我的裸体，她被烧至成型，和你的并无区别。不知道别的罪，除了10000次加深自己的罪。不落进泥土，只落进流不动的江水中。不在乎石头含着的金黄，得继续含着，像滴杜甫的老泪。不让这首诗沉沦为冷漠死寂的美。That's a poem.
Thank you very much, dear Lian. Thank you very much. We will subtitle it so all the viewers will also be able to understand it. I also brought a very short poem in Slovenian. I'll read it to all of you. There is no special story behind it. It's from a rather old book now already, but I'm struggling between moments of great hope and anticipation and the feeling that I'm here, I have to do something now, something not for me, for the community, for all the people I feel connected to, and I got so much, and I would love to return it in those days even more than before. And then there is this other side of me who is speaking perhaps this kind of thoughts. Človek je senca, ki jo črka meče, črka gre vse posod, senca ne zapusti votline. A person is a shadow thrown by a letter. The letter goes everywhere. The shadow doesn't leave the cave. A bit of philosophical, let's say, small thought. Besides of asking you to prepare a poem, I kindly ask you also to prepare excerpts or short poems written by others, or ideas, thoughts on the theme of hope. And to conclude our session, our opening session of the Festival of Hope, I'd like to ask you perhaps to read one or two of those and to comment a bit, to explain what made you choosing just these ideas and how do you feel connected in any way with them. Lian, would you start?
Well, actually, I have two choices. And well, one from ancient Chinese in the Tang Dynasty. It's also a very famous poet called Bai Juyi, and he has one poem which titled in English is "Saying Goodbye Among the Grasses on the Ancient Plain." It's goodbye farewell poem, but the two lines in the poems are so famous in China because that, let's say, represent this hope, which you never, you can always keep in your hand. Is again like classical Chinese poetry. It's using the natural images and to express that feeling. The two lines in Chinese is like 野火烧不尽，春风吹又生，and the translation, which I urgently asked my English translator Brian Houghton, made the translation because he's talking about the grasses and it's something like that. Wildfires will not burn the grass, burn them up. For spring breezes, wind will blow and the grasses will rise again. The wildfires will never burn up the grasses because when the spring winds come and the grasses will rising again. And this always gives the people a kind of a symbol of hope, which in the very hopeless situation, because when the wildfires burn everything, it seems everything is dead. But again, when the spring coming and the green came back again. So Chinese people for more than 1,200 years using this two sentences to support each other when the people meet the difficulties in the country, in the family, in the self, and believe or hope the grass will turn to green again. And this is one poem. And secondly, I myself, because I've been exiled for quite a long time, since 1989. So that's one important reference as China and as myself, Russia, the poets from the Soviet Union. And so Osip Mandelstam was one of the poets has been put in the desperately hopeless situation. But at one of the, in the almost the last year or last 2 years of his life, 1937, 1938, he wrote so many poems and terrible, described the life in a terrible way, but again, keeping the hope, the light of hope in the poem. This poem, I find it's only in English translation and the Chinese translation. I didn't really find the Russian original yet, but I will send to you and you will find it. In the English, it's roughly like the ranks of human heads, drawn though they are far away. Well, this is again the images like the human heads is listed there and like a long endless line and moving too far away. And I am myself is one of them. Again, one had been forgotten, but within the loving words, I will rising again to say the sun. And in this again the totally situation, but poets in the within the energy of writing and energy of creativities, and actually you still believe the sun, like the ancient Chinese poet. I think after all, the sun is not somewhere else, but sun is inside of the poet himself. And yeah, I think that's the nice point for all of us.
Thank you very much, Lian. Thank you to Berlin to share share these wonderful poems and thoughts with us. Sharmistha, what did you pick?
Aleš, I have two very brief poems. One is Falling to Hope, and it's just about poetry. So I just quickly read you both. One is, the first one is from a 12th century poet called Basavanna, and this is a translation from the Indian language Kannada. The rich will make temples for Shiva. What shall I, a poor man, do? My legs are pillars, the body the shrine, the head a cupola of gold. Listen, O Lord of the meeting rivers. Things standing shall fall, the moving ever shall stay. And then this is just about poetry, but it's so beautiful when I was looking for something to read. This is from the 18th century, very old poet called Tukaram. To arrange words in some order is not the same thing as the inner poise that's poetry. The truth of poetry is the truth of being. It's an experience of truth. No ornaments survive a crucible. Fire reveals only molten gold. We are here to reveal. We do not waste words.
This is absolutely beautiful, Sharmistha.
Thank you. I know I did. Two of my favorite poems, actually.
Thank you very much for sharing this and also your thoughts from Mumbai. Carolyn.
I'd like to share a poem I have from memory. And like Lian, I chose someone from the former Soviet Union, the great poet Anna Akhmatova.
Oh.
I've always been inspired by the preface to her poem Requiem, because it speaks to the possibility of poetry, especially in times as challenging as hers were and as ours are now. She's speaking in this poem about the experience of trying to bring provisions to her son who was in prison. And so the poem is, in the terrible years of the Yesov terror, I spent 17 months waiting in line outside a prison in Leningrad. One day, somebody recognized me. Standing behind me was a woman, her face blue from the cold, who had, of course, never heard me called by name before. Now she started out of the torpor common to us all and asked me in a whisper. Everyone whispered there. Can you describe this? And I said, I can. Then something like a smile passed fleetingly over what had once been her face. The other thing I share is by a monk, Thomas Merton, who is also a poet. And he lived a secluded life in a Trappist monastery, as we are all secluded now. And he has something to say about it, about that. This is a statement of his. At the corner of 4th and Walnut, in the center of the shopping district, I was suddenly overwhelmed with the realization that I loved all those people, that they were mine and I theirs, that we could not be alien to one another, even though we were total strangers. It was like waking from a dream of separateness, of spurious self-isolation in a special world, the world of renunciation and supposed holiness. If only everybody could realize this, but it cannot be explained. There is no way of telling people that they are all walking around shining like the sun.
Very beautiful.
Very beautiful. Thank you very, very much, Carolyn. I was trying to do the same. I typed in and Googled hope quotes, and I've got millions of quotes about hope. I felt like completely polluted by thoughts about hope. I have a couple of very strange ones here. One by Aristotle: hope is a waking dream. Or Francis Bacon, the philosopher: hope is a good breakfast, but it is a bad supper. or a Shakespearean one: the miserable have no other medicine but only hope. But I mean, one can very hardly connect to this kind of hope quotes in our times. Where I really can connect is at least for me, and many probably also of you all know it, and many of our viewers will know it, is for me the ultimate hope poem by Emily Dickinson, who was leading a very secluded life, the way we are secluded. And this seclusion is also now, and this seclusion also made our conversation tonight possible. And I'd like to thank you from all my heart for joining and for sharing your wonderful work and your very intriguing ideas with us, celebrating hope, and I hope a much more brighter future for everyone. Let me finish perhaps with just this first line.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lian, for first lines by Emily Dickinson. Hope is the thing with feathers that perches in the soul and sings the tune without the words and never stops at all. Thank you one more time, and stay with us in the next week and what will follow after. There are over 50 international poetry festivals from around the world and other literary institutions that have joined our efforts to say that poetry is hope and there is hope. And I hope that we will see each other.
We hope.
All the best. Thank you.
Thank you, Aleš. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Carolyn.
Bye.
Thank you, Sharmistha.